In April of 2006, Trey Parker and Matt Stone spent 2 full episodes of South Park drawing the Family Guy writing process as a tank of sea cows pushing colored balls into a machine. The argument was that the show was so mechanical, so disconnected from real storytelling, that a sea mammal could do the writing and nobody would notice. Inside 2 years, the Family Guy writers themselves had adopted the term manatee jokes for their own work, on their own DVD commentaries, in their own meetings, in their own vocabulary. The show being mocked agreed with the mockers so completely that the mockers' insult became the show's professional shorthand. Family Guy is the most successful copy in modern animation history. 2 federal lawsuits, a documented rivalry with The Simpsons, a recycled student film at the foundation. Tonight, we walk through the receipts. Welcome back to Red Umbrella. Let us begin. The Larry Problem. The show was a recycle of a recycle. Before there was a Peter Griffin, there was a Larry Cummings. Before Brian, there was Steve. Before the city of Quahog, there was a small student film made in a college kitchen in Rhode Island on a budget that would barely buy groceries today. The story most people know about Family Guy starts in 1999, with the show airing right after the Super Bowl and pulling in 22 million viewers. The story almost nobody talks about starts 4 years earlier, in 1995, in a senior thesis project at the Rhode Island School of Design. Seth MacFarlane was 21 years old. He needed a final project to graduate. What he turned in was a 10-minute animated short called The Life of Larry. The film starred a middle-aged, slightly overweight, slightly clueless suburban dad named Larry Cummings. Larry had a wife named Lois. Larry had a son named Milt. Larry had a sarcastic talking dog named Steve, who could only really be understood by Larry himself. The art style was rougher, the voices were a touch less polished, but anyone who has ever watched a single episode of Family Guy, watching that short film today, would feel something strange happen in the first 30 seconds. They would recognize the show. Not the early version of it, the actual show. The same rhythms, the same kind of cutaway gags, the same dim but loving father, the same patient red-headed wife, the same talking dog who acts more like a roommate than a pet. The whole thing was already there. The Life of Larry got noticed by a development executive at Hanna-Barbera named Ellen Cockrill. Cockrill was at the senior screening, saw the film, and brought MacFarlane in for a job. He was hired based on his writing, not his drawing skills, which is a small detail that ends up mattering a lot. He worked on Cartoon Network shows for a while. He was given a budget to make a follow-up to The Life of Larry. That follow-up came out in 1997 and aired as part of Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon block. The new short was called Larry and Steve. It aired on February 5th of that year. It was aimed at kids, so the humor was cleaner, but the bones of the show were exactly what would later become Family Guy. Larry has the same voice and personality as Peter would later have. Steve has the same voice and personality as Brian would later have. There was even a side character, an airline pilot, who had a chin and a voice that anyone watching today would instantly recognize as Glenn Quagmire. He was already there too, in 1997, 2 years before Family Guy was supposed to have invented him. Then came the part of the story that gets retold as a triumph. Fox saw the Larry shorts. They contacted MacFarlane and gave him a budget of $50,000 to put together a 15-minute pilot for a new primetime animated show. He spent 6 months at his kitchen table, drawing constantly, sleeping barely. He pitched the finished pilot to Fox on May 15th, 1998. Fox greenlit the show. The first episode of Family Guy, called Death Has a Shadow, aired on January 31st, 1999, after Super Bowl 33. The legend was born. Here is the part of the legend that does not survive a careful look. The reason Death Has a Shadow felt so confident, so fully formed, so much like a show that already knew what it was, is that the show already existed. It had existed since 1995. The original pilot of Family Guy, the one MacFarlane drew on his kitchen table in 1998, was not a fresh creation. It was a redraw. Larry got rounder and was renamed Peter. Steve got slimmer and was renamed Brian. Lois stayed Lois because Larry's wife had also been named Lois. Milt got renamed Chris and turned into a teenage version of the same character. The dog and the dad still had the relationship the dog and the dad had always had, where the dog was the smart one and the dad was the loving idiot. MacFarlane himself has described the difference between the two in the simplest possible terms. He said the only real distinction was that the first one screened in his dorm room and the second one screened after the Super Bowl. The reused parts go deeper than the characters. Specific jokes that appeared in The Life of Larry in 1995 were dropped almost word for word into the very first episode of Family Guy in 1999. There is a flashback in The Life of Larry where Larry sees the city of Philadelphia for the first time. That same flashback, in almost the same form, appears in Death Has a Shadow as a Peter Griffin gag. There is a joke in The Life of Larry where Larry farts for the first time at age 30 and is so confused confused about what just happened that he fires a gun in a panic. That joke, slightly cleaned up, appears in the Family Guy pilot. There is a brief gag in the original short where God is shown getting embarrassed by a priest who keeps bringing up how badly God treated the character Job from the Bible. That gag appears in Death Has a Shadow. There is a Star Trek parody in Larry that shows up almost untouched in the second Family Guy episode, I Never Met the Dead Man. This is where the word recycle starts to feel like the right one. A normal creative process involves a person learning, growing, and eventually creating something new. A recycle is something else. A recycle is taking the same material, melting it down, and pouring it into a slightly different mold so it can be sold again. The pilot of Family Guy was not a writer pulling from his old work for inspiration. It was a writer running the same gags through a slightly more polished version of the same machine. Even the live-action wraparound segments from The Life of Larry, where McFarlane sits at home being served snacks by a friend dressed as a butler, would later show up reworked in the Adult Swim promotional clips for Family Guy. His first line in the original short was, "Oh, hi there, you scared the crap out of me." He repeated that exact line in his Family Guy promos a decade later. The Hanna-Barbera connection matters here too. McFarlane was hired into a studio that had spent its entire history doing exactly the thing Family Guy would later be accused of, which is taking somebody else's idea and animating a slightly altered version of it. Hanna-Barbera was the studio that made The Flintstones, which was a cartoon copy of a 1950s show called The Honeymooners that was so close to the original that the man who made The Honeymooners genuinely thought about suing them. The man decided not to sue because he did not want to be remembered as the guy who killed Fred Flintstone, but the borrowing was open and known. McFarlane got his first job at the studio that built its empire by taking the family sitcom template and animating it. Then he made his own family sitcom, animated, that he had already built before he got to the studio. The lineage of borrowing was already in the building before he showed up. There is something almost too tidy about the way this whole origin story has been packaged over the years. The standard telling goes like this. A young animator made a thesis film. Some executives saw it, a network gave him a chance, he created Family Guy. The show became a sensation. The standard telling treats the thesis film as a kind of inspiration, a seed that grew into a tree. The reality is closer to saying that the thesis film was the tree, and the show that aired on Fox was a slightly larger version of the same tree, painted a different color. The pilot was not built from scratch in 1998. The pilot was the third draft of a project that started in 1995. The fact that the pilot felt finished, that it felt like a show that already knew what it was, is not a sign of brilliance. It is a sign that the show had been quietly running for 4 years already, in places where almost nobody could see it. Even the names on the original short kept showing up later. A character called Shelley Booth Bishop, who appeared in The Life of Larry, made it onto Family Guy in episodes including There's Something About Polly, North by North Quahog, and Long John Peter. Larry himself, the original 1995 protagonist, has cameoed on Family Guy in his original form. In the episode Happy Halloween, when the family destroys an evil holographic version of Peter, the hologram briefly malfunctions and shows Larry. The hologram also briefly shows Homer Simpson and Fred Flintstone, which feels almost like the writers admitting the lineage in the same shot, as if the show is daring you to notice. None of this means McFarlane did not work hard. He clearly did. 6 months at a kitchen table is real work. Building an animation studio from scratch and running it for over 25 years is real work. The point is not that he was lazy. The point is that the show that the world thinks of as a fresh creative explosion in 1999 was nothing of the kind. It was a project that had been incubating for 4 years in 2 earlier forms, both of which had the same characters, the same jokes, the same voices, and the same comedic engine. The thing that aired on Fox was the third version of the same idea. This matters because the rest of the case against Family Guy's originality only works if the foundation is honest. Once you accept that the show began as a recycled version of a student film, the later questions become easier to ask. If the show was already a recycle of itself before it ever reached television, the question of what else it might be a recycle of becomes a fair one to start asking. The Life of Larry was the foundation. The foundation was already secondhand. Anything built on top of it was secondhand by default. There is one more thing about The Life of Larry that is worth holding on to. The dad in that short, Larry, was not himself a fully invented character. The voice McFarlane gave him was based on a security guard he had once overheard talking while at school. The dad's body shape, his cluelessness, his slightly aggrieved relationship with the world, these were not new ideas in 1995. They were the same ideas that had been running through American family comedy since before McFarlane was born. The dim, well-meaning, slightly pathetic suburban father had been a TV staple staple for decades by the time Larry showed up. So even the original character, the one Family Guy was eventually built on top of, was already a copy of a type that was 40 years old. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That observation leads directly to a much harder question, one that opens up the next part of this whole investigation. If the show began as a recycle of a student film, and the student film was itself built on a character type that had been around since the 1950s, then the trail does not end at the life of Larry. The trail keeps going. Peter Griffin, the character we now think of as the face of one of the longest-running animated shows in history, did not just come from Larry. Larry came from somewhere too, and the somewhere he came from has a name. Section 2. Peter Griffin is not one character, he's a stack of 3. The character that the trail leads to first lived in a small apartment in Brooklyn. He drove a bus for the Gotham Bus Company. He came home tired, sat at his kitchen table, fought with his wife about money, and dreamed of a get-rich-quick scheme that would never work. His name was Ralph Kramden. The show he lived in was called The Honeymooners. It started as a sketch on a variety show in 1951, became its own series in 1955, and ran in repeats for the next 60 years, becoming one of the most copied templates in American television history. Ralph Kramden was loud. He was overweight. He was a working-class man who genuinely believed he was a step away from greatness, and the show kept proving, gently and sometimes cruelly, that he was wrong. He had a long-suffering wife named Alice, who put up with his bluster. He had a best friend named Ed Norton, who was dumber than him and yet somehow ended up being right more often. Ralph had a famous line he would shout at Alice when he got pushed too far. He would raise his fist and yell that he was going to send her straight to the moon. He never followed through. He always came back at the end of the episode and admitted that Alice was the greatest thing in his life. The show lived in that gap between the man Ralph pretended to be and the man he actually was. Ralph Kramden was not just a character, he was a template. Within 5 years of The Honeymooners going off the air, the studio Hanna-Barbera made a cartoon called The Flintstones that copied the template so closely that the actor who played Ralph, Jackie Gleason, seriously considered suing them. Fred Flintstone had Ralph's body shape, Ralph's job at the bottom of the food chain, Ralph's loud temper, and Ralph's patient wife. Fred even had a best friend named Barney, who lived in the role Ed Norton had occupied. Gleason ended up not suing because his publicist asked him a single question. Did he want to be remembered forever as the man who killed Fred Flintstone? He did not. He let it go. The Flintstones aired for 6 years on primetime television and became one of the most successful animated shows of the 1960s, built on a foundation that almost ended up in court. The template kept getting passed down. In 1971, a writer named Norman Lear took a big swing and made a sitcom called All in the Family. The lead character was named Archie Bunker. Archie was a working-class man, slightly overweight, loud, with strong opinions about almost everything, who lived in a small house with his patient wife Edith and bickered constantly with the world around him. The show was sharper and more political than The Honeymooners or The Flintstones, but the family DNA was the same. The dim, loud, scheming father, the patient wife, the chair he sat in, the arguments that went nowhere. All in the Family won every Emmy in sight, ran for 9 years, and became one of the most influential American sitcoms ever made. Then, in 1989, Matt Groening introduced Homer Simpson. Homer worked at a power plant. Homer was overweight. Homer was loud. Homer had a patient wife named Marge, and a short attention span and a get-rich-quick gleam in his eye. Homer drank at a local bar with a tight group of friends. He came home, sat in his chair, and watched television. The Simpsons writers were not hiding the lineage. There is a scene in The Simpsons where a network executive named Roger Myers gives a speech defending the right to copy old ideas. He says that animation is built on plagiarism. He says that without somebody plagiarizing The Honeymooners, there would be no Flintstones. The show acknowledged its own debt openly, on screen, in a scene that has become one of the most quoted moments in the history of animated television. By the time McFarlane started drawing Larry Cummings in 1995, the loud, overweight, working-class dad with patient wife template had been running for 44 years. It had passed from Ralph Kramden to Fred Flintstone to Archie Bunker to Homer Simpson, picking up small variations at each stop but keeping the bones intact. Peter Griffin was the next stop on a train that had been moving for 4 decades. What makes Peter different from the usual influence story is how openly the show admits it. McFarlane has said in multiple interviews that his comedy heroes include Jackie Gleason, the man who played Ralph Kramden. He has said his work on Family Guy was directly influenced by Jackie Gleason and All in the Family. He has gone on the record saying that one of the reasons he believes Family Guy has lasted is the same reason Gleason once gave for The Honeymooners lasting, which which is that it just makes people laugh. These are not vague nods. These are specific borrowings, named out loud by the creator in conversations a person can read today. The clearest example is the Family Guy opening credits sequence. The opening shows Peter and Lois sitting at a piano, singing the show's theme song together about how good values used to be. That image, the husband and wife sitting at a piano singing a nostalgic song about old-fashioned values, is a frame-for-frame echo of the opening credits to All in the Family, where Archie and Edith Bunker sit at a piano singing a song called Those Were the Days, about how good values used to be. McFarlane confirmed this on the show's own DVD commentary. He said directly that the piano opening was inspired by All in the Family. There is no hidden borrowing here. There is a creator pointing at the source and explaining that he took the image and put his own characters into it. The borrowings continue through the whole show. In an episode called Stewie Loves Lois, the closing credits parody the closing credits of All in the Family almost shot for shot. In the episode PTV, Peter shows what he claims is the original version of an All in the Family episode, in which Archie and Edith try to scare their black neighbors into moving by burning a cross on their lawn. That gag is a reference to a real All in the Family episode from 1977 called Archie and the KKK, in which Archie tries to stop a real cross burning. The Family Guy version flips it, but the source it is flipping is named directly. In another episode called Pawtucket Pat, when Peter wants to behave like an old-fashioned husband, he tells Lois to stifle herself and sits down with a cigar in a chair, doing a direct impression of Archie Bunker. The show is not subtle about this. The show keeps walking past the source and waving. The Honeymooners borrowings are equally direct. In When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, Ralph Kramden himself appears as a character, threatening to beat Indiana Jones to the moon for taking too long to switch out an idol. In Mr. Saturday night, Lois references a specific Honeymooners episode where Ralph lost his job and never got it back. In North by North Quahog, the Griffins watch a fake episode of the Honeymooners where Ralph actually does follow through on his threat and beats Alice to the moon. In an episode called The Fat Guy Strangler, a side character is shown to have been emotionally damaged as a child by walking in on his mother having an affair with Jackie Gleason, who shouts a Honeymooner's catchphrase at the moment of climax. In an episode called 80s Guy, Peter actually quotes Ralph's threat directly, telling Lois he will beat her to the moon. In an episode called Family Guy Through the Years, the show imagines what a 1950s version of Family Guy would have looked like, and the answer is a frame-by-frame parody of the Honeymooners, with the Griffins playing Ralph and Alice. The borrowing is so thorough that the show has, at this point, built an entire alternate history of itself, in which it is just openly the Honeymooners, with the names changed. The connection to Homer Simpson sits in plain view, and the show has admitted it more than once. In the episode Big Man on Hippocampus, Peter loses his memory and cannot remember his own catchphrase, so he defaults to using Homer's catchphrase, the famous frustrated grunt that Homer uses on The Simpsons. The joke only works because the writers are admitting that Peter is so close to Homer that, without his memory to remind him of the difference, he would just become Homer. In another episode called Save the Clam, a drunken Peter lists his greatest moments in life, and the moments he lists are not Family Guy moments. They are Simpsons moments. He talks about Maggie's first word, about the famous Mr. Plow episode, about Bart jumping a canyon on a skateboard. The show, in that scene, lets Peter accidentally confess that the highlights of his own existence are scenes from another show entirely. The most direct admission of all comes in an episode called Guy Robot. In that episode, Peter, drunk again, says out loud that the show actually steals a lot from The Simpsons. There is no metaphor here, no symbolism. The character voiced by the show's creator says, on the show, that the show steals a lot from The Simpsons. It is the kind of joke that only works if the creator and the audience and the writers are all in agreement that the borrowing is real. If the borrowing were not real, the joke would not land. The line is the punchline of an inside joke that the show has been telling on itself for years. What is interesting about all of this is that none of it is hidden. McFarlane has not tried to claim Peter Griffin came out of nowhere. He has openly said that his influences include Jackie Gleason, Norman Lear, and Matt Groening. He has put their characters and their templates inside his own show, on purpose, with credit. The case against Family Guy's originality on the character of Peter Griffin is not a case the show is trying to deny. It is a case the show keeps making, year after year, in episode after episode, by walking up to the source material and pointing at it. The defense usually offered for this is that all comedy borrows. That defense has a real point inside it. The Simpsons borrowed from the Flintstones, which borrowed from the Honeymooners, which borrowed from a stage stage tradition that went back to vaudeville. Nothing in comedy is fully fresh. The fact that Peter has Ralph's body and Archie's chair and Homer's catchphrase does not, on its own, prove the show is unoriginal in some special sense. The problem is what comes next. Most shows take an old template and add something genuinely new on top of it. The Honeymooners took the bickering married couple sketch and added depth, gave Ralph an inner life, made his failures actually mean something. The Flintstones took the Honeymooners template and added the prehistoric setting, the visual jokes about Stone Age technology, the repurposing of a black and white sitcom for color cartoon primetime. All in the Family took the loud dad template and added real political content, real social commentary, real engagement with the actual America of 1971. The Simpsons took the bunker template and added the satirical edge, the absurd town of Springfield, the willingness to break the rules of how a sitcom could move. Each show added something the show before it did not have. Family Guy's addition to this lineage is harder to name. The show certainly has its own flavor, its own tone, its own specific kind of cruelty and absurdity. The cutaway gags are part of that flavor, but those came from somewhere too, and that question gets answered later. The character of Peter himself, the central engine of the show, the face on every poster and every piece of merchandise, has not added a new ingredient to the recipe. He has refined the existing recipe. He has been made denser, faster, ruder. He has been pushed further into stupidity than Homer ever was, and further into cruelty than Archie ever was, and further into self-destruction than Ralph ever was. But the dish is the same dish. The chef has just turned the heat up. This refinement, this turning up of the heat, is part of what made Family Guy successful. Audiences in 1999 had spent 44 years getting trained on the loud, overweight, working-class dad with patient wife template. Family Guy gave them the most extreme version of that template they had ever seen. It was a familiar feeling, delivered in a stronger dose. The show was not asking the audience to accept a new kind of character. It was asking the audience to accept a more aggressive version of a character they already knew by heart. That is the case for Peter Griffin being a stack of three. Ralph Kramden gave him the body, the temper, the dreamer-husband relationship with his wife, and the catchphrase about the moon. Archie Bunker gave him the chair, the political incorrectness, the cigar, and the piano-singing opening credits. Homer Simpson gave him the bar with the friends, the local anchorman on the news structure, the dumb dad with patient redhead wife setup, and the willingness to break a fourth wall when it suited him. The show has admitted, in episodes a person can stream tonight, that all three of these deaths are real. There is no investigation here. There is only a record. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The character is a stack. The show knows it is a stack. The audience knows it is a stack. The only thing left to figure out is what else the stack is hiding. Because Peter is one part of the show, the way the show actually moves, the way it cuts and jumps and refuses to stay still, has its own history. And that history goes back to a desert cartoon, a slapstick film series, and one very specific moment in a 1992 movie that almost nobody connects to Family Guy at all. Section 3. The cutaway wasn't invented here. The cutaway gag is the move most people associate with Family Guy. A character will be sitting in the kitchen in the middle of a normal conversation, and somebody will say something like this, "Is even worse than that time I tried to learn ballet." The screen will flash white, the picture will jump to a totally unrelated scene of Peter in a tutu falling over a barrel. 3 seconds later, the picture will jump back to the kitchen, and the conversation will continue as if nothing happened. That little jump, that side trip out of the main story and back, is the engine of Family Guy. The show runs on it. A normal episode might have 10 or 12 of these jumps. A heavy episode might have 20. The cutaway gag is so closely tied to Family Guy in the public mind that the entire format is sometimes just called a Family Guy joke. The cutaway gag is not a Family Guy invention. It existed long before Family Guy. It existed in a comic strip drawn one panel at a time. It existed in a series of slapstick films from the 1980s. It existed in a Saturday Night Live spin-off from 1992. The show did not create the move. The show borrowed the move, sped it up, and ran it into the ground until people forgot the move had a history. The first place the cutaway lived was on a single page of newspaper in a comic strip called The Far Side. The Far Side was drawn by a cartoonist named Gary Larson, and it ran in newspapers around the world from 1980 to 1995. Each strip was one panel. Each panel was one joke. Larson would set up an absurd scene with a single drawing, drop a one-line caption underneath it, and that was the whole comic. There would be a panel of cows standing on two legs, having a conversation about how grass tasted today. There would be a panel of a scientist stuck stuck inside a giant glass jar with a label on it. There would be a panel of God making the universe, looking down at his recipe and noticing he had added too many jerks. Each strip was a small, unrelated explosion of weirdness, completely disconnected from the strip before it and the strip after it. The cutaway gag, as Family Guy uses it, is a Far Side panel dropped into the middle of a sitcom. The setup line in the kitchen is the caption. The scene that follows is the drawing. The jump back to the kitchen is the page being turned. The whole thing works exactly like a Far Side strip, except it has been sliced into a moving image and dropped inside another show. McFarlane has said directly that Gary Larson was one of his major graphic influences as a cartoonist. The proof of the borrowing is not hidden. The cartoonist who created the format named Larson as his hero. Then the cartoonist took the format Larson invented for newspapers and converted it for television. There is a real difference between a Far Side panel and a Family Guy cutaway, but it is a difference of speed, not of structure. Larson published one panel a day. The reader had 24 hours between strips to enjoy the joke and let it settle. Family Guy puts 12 of those panels into a single 22-minute episode. The format is the same, the pacing is just compressed to the point where it becomes a different kind of experience. The show took a once-a-day comic strip joke and turned it into a once-a-minute joke. The structure stayed the same, the volume just got cranked up. The second place the cutaway lived was in a series of films and a short-lived TV show made by three brothers and a friend. The team was made up of David Zucker, Jerry Zucker, Jim Abrahams, and Pat Proft. They first became famous for a movie called Airplane in 1980. They followed it up with a TV show in 1982 called Police Squad, which only lasted 6 episodes but became a cult favorite. They then made the Naked Gun movies in 1988, 1991, and 1994, which are some of the most influential comedies in American film history. The thing the Zucker team did again and again was the cutaway gag. A character on Police Squad would be in the middle of a serious-looking police investigation, and somebody would mention that they were going to deal with the criminals once and for all, and the screen would jump to a totally unrelated shot of a man getting hit in the face with a fish, and then it would jump back. A character in the Naked Gun would say something like, "Things were really getting out of hand," and the screen would jump to a shot of giant disembodied hands knocking over buildings, and then it would jump back. The setup line, the visual punchline, the jump back to the main scene, the exact engine Family Guy runs on. The Zucker team built that engine in the early 1980s, ran it through a TV show and 3 movies, and made it one of the signature moves of American screen comedy by the time McFarlane was in middle school. The borrowing here is not just a vibe, it can be time-stamped. Family Guy has an entire episode called PTV, which aired in 2005. The opening of PTV is a parody of the opening of The Naked Gun, the 1988 film. Stewie is unmasked and revealed as a fake terrorist, just as Leslie Nielsen's character was in the original. The opening credits of PTV are a copy of the opening credits of Police Squad and The Naked Gun, with the camera following Stewie's tricycle the way the original films followed a police car. The music underneath the sequence is the actual music from the original films, written by a composer named Ira Newborn. There is a fight between Stewie and Osama bin Laden that mirrors a sword fight from a Star Wars movie. The Family Guy Wiki, which is run by fans of the show, describes the entire opening of PTV as a direct parody of the opening of The Naked Gun. The show went on the record in its own materials that this was a copy. The third place the cutaway lived was in a film from 1992 called Wayne's World. Wayne's World started as a sketch on Saturday Night Live in 1989, where 2 heavy metal-loving teenagers named Wayne and Garth would host a public access cable show from a basement. The film version came out in 1992 and made over $180 million. One of the moves Wayne's World popularized was the dream cutaway joke, where a character would say something like, "Let's pretend," and the screen would shift to a fantasy version of what was being described, and then the screen would shift back. The film was full of these. There is a moment where Wayne is daydreaming about his ideal romantic moment with a woman named Cassandra, and the screen jumps to a slow-motion fantasy of the 2 of them on a beach, and then it jumps back. There is a moment where Wayne lists what would happen if the band's tour failed, and the screen jumps to a cartoon version of the disaster, and then it jumps back. The pace was faster than Police Squad. The pace was slower than what Family Guy would later do. The format was identical. The cutaway, by the time Family Guy started borrowing it in 1999, had been a working format in American comedy for 19 years. It had moved from comic strips to films to TV shows to sketch comedy. Every version had used the same engine: the setup line, the cut to something unrelated, the cut back. Family Guy's contribution to the format was speed. The show ran the move so often, so fast, and with so little connection connection to the rest of the plot that the format eventually became more associated with Family Guy than with any of the original creators. By the late 2000s, an entire generation of viewers thought Family Guy invented the cutaway. The original sources had been so completely paved over that the road no longer had a sign on it. There is a smaller borrowing inside this larger one that is worth holding on to. Family Guy's cutaways often follow a specific phrase. A character will say, "This is even worse than that time," or "This is just like the time," and the cutaway will follow. That phrase pattern itself is borrowed. The Far Side did not use it because the Far Side did not need it, since the Far Side was just one panel at a time. Police Squad and The Naked Gun did not use it because their humor was straight-faced. The phrase pattern came from a different source. It came from sitcom writing in general, and specifically from the kind of throwaway flashback gags that older sitcoms had been using since the 1960s. Family Guy combined the comic strip structure of Larson, the visual gags of the Zucker films, and the connecting phrases of older sitcoms into a single, unified format. The combination was new in a small sense. The pieces were all secondhand. The Simpsons writers noticed all of this in real time. The Simpsons had occasionally used cutaway-style gags in its early years. After Family Guy started running them at high speed, the Simpsons writers actively pulled back on the format. According to a DVD commentary recorded by the Simpsons production team, the writers stopped writing cutaway gags on purpose because Family Guy had taken over the format so completely. The Simpsons writers did not see the move as their property to defend. They saw it as a tool that another show had picked up and started using, and they did not want to be confused for the show using the tool. The cutaway, in other words, was not a Family Guy invention even by the standards of the show that came right before it. The format had been around long enough that one of the most successful sitcoms in television history could just choose to stop using it without anybody feeling like the move had been taken away from them. The original creators of the format have been quiet about the borrowing. Gary Larson retired from drawing The Far Side in 1995, 4 years before Family Guy aired, and has stayed mostly out of public life since. The Zucker brothers have not made it a public issue. Mike Myers, who created Wayne's World, has not weighed in. There has been no lawsuit, no public fight, no formal complaint. This silence is part of what has let the borrowing fade from the public memory. The original creators did not push back, so the link between their work and Family Guy's work was not constantly reinforced. Without that pushback, the format simply became Family Guy's property in the public mind, even though the receipts for the borrowing are on the record for anyone who wants to look. The case against the show's originality, when it comes to the cutaway, is not that the format is bad, or that the show should have done something different. The format is great. That is why so many other people invented it before Family Guy did. The case is just that the format has a paper trail, and the paper trail starts in 1980 with a comic strip about cows, runs through 1982 with a slapstick TV show about a clueless detective, runs through the late 1980s with a series of slapstick films, runs through 1992 with a movie about two basement-dwelling rock fans, and only arrives at Family Guy in 1999 as the latest stop on a route that already had 4 major stations on it. The show took the format and made it run faster than anyone else had run it. That is a real skill. Speed is not nothing. Compression is not nothing. There's a real argument that what Family Guy did with the cutaway is just as important as what Larson and the Zuckers did before. But that argument is a different argument from the one that says the show was original. Speeding up something somebody else built is not the same as building it. A faster car is still a car. The car was invented before you got to it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. By 2006, all of these borrowings, the character template from the Loud Dad lineage, the cutaway from Larson and the Zuckers, the gags lifted from McFarlane's own student film, had piled up into something that could no longer be ignored. The pile was big enough that it became impossible for the rest of the comedy world to keep treating Family Guy as just one more show in the lineup. Something was going to have to give. And what gave, in April of that year, was a 2-part episode of South Park that walked into the conversation and changed the way Family Guy was talked about for the rest of its run. Section 4, Cartoon Wars, when South Park diagrammed the theft. The episode aired on Comedy Central on April 5th, 2006. It was the 3rd episode of the 10th season of South Park. The title was Cartoon Wars Part 1. A week later, on April 12th, the 2nd part aired. Together, these 2 episodes did something that had never been done in animated television before. One show stopped its own normal storyline to spend 44 minutes diagramming exactly how another show was made. Not parodying it, not making fun of its tone, diagramming it, drawing the writing process on the screen and labeling the parts. The setup of the first episode is straightforward. The town of South Park goes into a panic because Family Guy is about to air an episode that shows shows the Prophet Muhammad. The townspeople are afraid this will lead to a terrorist attack. They bury their heads in sand to show they had nothing to do with it. The boys, Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny, end up on opposite sides of the question. Kyle thinks Family Guy has the right to air whatever it wants because that is what free speech means. Cartman wants the episode pulled. The two of them race across the country on big wheels to reach the offices of Fox in Hollywood, with the fate of Family Guy resting on which one of them gets there first. What makes the episode unusual is what happens about halfway through. Cartman, who is the loudest character on South Park, the most offensive, the most willing to break every rule, suddenly explains why he wants Family Guy off the air. The reason is simple. He hates being compared to it. He cannot stand that people see his style of humor and assume it is the same thing as the humor on Family Guy. The character delivers the line that became one of the most quoted moments in the show's history. He says that everywhere he goes, people tell him his sense of humor reminds them of Family Guy. He says he is nothing like Family Guy. He says when he makes jokes, the jokes are inherent to a story, that they are deep, situational, emotional jokes based on what is relevant and has a point. Then he says the line that diagrammed the entire problem in a single sentence. He says Family Guy is just one interchangeable joke after another. That word, interchangeable, is the entire critique. A joke is interchangeable when you can swap it for another joke without anything changing. A joke is interchangeable when it does not connect to the characters, the setting, or the story around it. A joke is interchangeable when it could be moved from one episode to another and nobody would notice. The argument Cartman is making, which is the argument the writers Trey Parker and Matt Stone are making through him, is that Family Guy's cutaways do not belong inside their own show. They could be lifted out, dropped into any other Family Guy episode, dropped into a totally different show, and the joke would work the same. Nothing about the cutaway depends on the story it is sitting inside. The second part of the episode took this argument and turned it into a literal picture. Cartman makes it to the Fox studios. He is taken to meet the writing staff of Family Guy. The reveal is one of the most famous gags in animated television. The Family Guy writers are not human beings. They are manatees. 5 large sea cows swimming in a tank with names like Gretchen, Flubber, Tigger, Pete, and Lucy. The manatees produce jokes by pushing colored balls around their tank with their noses. Each ball has one word on it, a noun, a verb, an adjective, the name of a celebrity, a pop culture reference. The manatees push 5 balls into a slot. The slot feeds into a machine. The machine combines the 5 words into a cutaway gag. The episode actually shows the process working. A manatee pushes the words laundry, date, winning, Mexico, and Gary Coleman into the machine. The machine produces a Family Guy joke about Peter winning a date in Mexico with Gary Coleman. This was not a vague insult. This was a working diagram. The argument the South Park writers were making was that Family Guy jokes could be reverse engineered by taking 5 random words and combining them. The implication was that there was no human creativity involved at all. The format was so mechanical that a sea mammal could do the writing and nobody would notice the difference. The episode even built a second layer into the joke. The manatees, the writers explain, will not work if a single ball is removed from their tank. They believe that if every word in the world cannot be used, then no word can be used. Cartman exploits this by stealing one ball, which causes the manatees to refuse to keep producing episodes. The whole show grinds to a halt because of one missing word. The reaction to the episode inside the rest of the comedy world was immediate. According to interviews Parker and Stone gave on the DVD commentary, the writers of The Simpsons sent flowers to the South Park offices. The writers of King of the Hill, another animated show on Fox at the time, called the South Park offices and told Parker and Stone that they were doing God's work. Parker said in an interview that the staff of The Simpsons hated Family Guy more than he and Stone did. Parker actually compared the situation to what was happening with the singer Justin Timberlake at the time, where everybody in the music industry seemed to have an opinion about him that they would only share off the record. The comparison Parker drew was that the entire animation industry felt the same way about Family Guy. They thought the writing was lazy. They thought the show was getting away with something. They wanted somebody to say it out loud, and now somebody had. The South Park writers were specific about what they hated. Parker said in interviews after the episode aired that he and Stone did not want Family Guy taken off the air. They understood that millions of people loved the show. They thought the writers behind Family Guy were genuinely smart people. The objection was not to the show's existence. The objection was to a single technical choice. Family Guy had decided that the joke did not have to connect to the story. South Park believed it did. That was the whole argument. 2 different theories of how a comedy episode should be built, fighting it out in public. What happened happened next is the part of the story that turns the criticism from a parody into a confession. The Family Guy writers, after watching themselves get diagrammed as a tank of sea mammals on national television, did not push back. They did not write an angry response episode right away. They did not deny the charge. What they did instead was something stranger. They started using the criticism as their own internal vocabulary. On the DVD commentaries for Family Guy episodes recorded after Cartoon Wars aired, the writers began referring to their own cutaway jokes as manatee jokes. The word stuck. It became a thing the staff would say to each other in the writer's room. They would describe a particular gag as a good manatee joke, or a weak manatee joke, or as something they should rework because it was too obvious a manatee joke. The vocabulary South Park had invented to mock them became the vocabulary they used to talk about themselves. That detail is what turns the whole episode from an external attack into an internal admission. The Family Guy writers, the people on the inside of the show, watched a parody that said the writing was so mechanical it could be done by sea cows. Their response was to agree. They agreed so thoroughly that they adopted the parody's language as their professional shorthand. The comedians being mocked started using the mockers word for what they were doing. There is no clearer way for one show to say to another, "You got us," than that. Every time a Family Guy writer sat in a meeting and called a joke a manatee joke, they were quietly confirming that South Park's diagram was correct. The diagram was so correct that the diagram became their own language for talking about their own work. The Family Guy writers eventually did make a counterattack of sorts. In a 2009 episode called Spies Reminiscent of Us, Peter and Quagmire end up in a comedy club where Quagmire tries to do clever, wordplay-based jokes and gets nothing from the crowd, while Peter does random pop culture cutaway gags and gets huge laughs. The episode was clearly meant as a defense of Family Guy's style and a shot back at South Park. The shot back was telling, though. It did not deny that Family Guy's jokes are random and disconnected. It just argued that random and disconnected jokes are funnier. The defense agreed with the criticism on every fact. The only thing it disputed was whether the criticism was actually a bad thing. There was an even more direct response that almost made it onto the show. Seth MacFarlane has said in DVD commentaries that for a 2008 episode called McStroke, his writers had planned a comeback gag. The gag was going to show Trey Parker and Matt Stone at a place called Anal Point, doing things that were too crude to describe in detail. MacFarlane decided the gag was too far. He cut it from the episode before it aired. He said it felt like it was in bad taste. The fact that the gag was even drafted, though, and was only stopped by MacFarlane himself at the last minute, says something about how much the original critique stung. The Family Guy team spent 2 years thinking about a way to hit back, came up with one, and then their own boss had to step in and say, "We cannot actually run this." The wound was real. The retaliation, when it finally came, was muted. There is another piece of evidence from inside the Family Guy team that confirms the manatee critique landed. In an episode called Family Guy Through the Years, Peter mentions, in a list of things the imaginary version of the show has survived, that the show has lived through a pretty good ribbing by those South Park guys. The episode treats the South Park parody as part of Family Guy's official history. The reference is short, almost throwaway, but it is the show putting on its own permanent record that the criticism was significant enough to deserve a mention. A show does not tip its hat to a critic unless the critic landed. The strangest part of the entire feud is what happened to the language outside both shows. The phrase manatee joke escaped Family Guy and South Park and became a real piece of television vocabulary that comedy writers and fans started using outside either show. The dictionary website Urban Dictionary has an entry for manatee joke that defines it as a kind of humor popularized by Family Guy. People who had never heard of South Park's diagram still ended up using the word. A piece of comedy vocabulary invented as an insult by one show ended up becoming the standard way an entire genre of humor is described. That kind of thing only happens when the original observation cuts so deep that nobody on either side of the argument can think of a better word for the thing. The most useful way to understand what Cartoon Wars did is to think of it as forensic work. South Park did not just say Family Guy was unoriginal. It explained in detail the specific mechanism that made it unoriginal. The mechanism was randomness. The mechanism was the lack of connection between the joke and the story. The mechanism was the willingness to swap out content with no consequences. South Park diagrammed the assembly line. They drew the workers. They labeled the parts. They put the whole process on screen for the audience to see. And the audience laughed because they recognized what they were looking at. Then, the people who actually ran the assembly line watched the diagram, recognized themselves in it, and started using the diagram as their own training material.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
seriously. That moment in 2006 was the high watermark of public criticism of Family Guy. After Cartoon Wars, the question of whether the show was original was no longer something that needed a long argument. The argument had been settled in cartoon form, in front of millions of viewers, with the cooperation of the people being criticized. But the criticism had only addressed one piece of the larger picture. The manatee gag was about the writing process. It said nothing about the legal record. And while South Park was animating sea cows in a tank, a different kind of attack on the show was already being prepared. One that involved real lawyers, real damages, and a real 73-year-old woman who had decided she had finally had enough. Section 5. The Carol Burnett lawsuit. The charwoman in the porn shop. Carol Burnett did not sue people. That was not her style. By the time she found herself listed as the plaintiff in a federal court case in March of 2007, she was 73 years old. She had spent her entire career making fun of other celebrities, parodying movies, doing impressions of her famous friends. Her own variety show, The Carol Burnett Show, had run on CBS for 11 years, from 1967 to 1978, and had built itself almost entirely on parody. She knew the rules. She knew what was fair game. She had spent 4 decades of her life being the person who took the joke. The fact that this particular joke ended up in a federal courthouse tells you something about how far Family Guy had crossed a line that almost nobody else had ever made her cross. The character at the center of the lawsuit was called the Charwoman. The Charwoman was Burnett's most famous creation. The character first appeared on The Carol Burnett Show in the late 1960s and became a regular feature for the entire 11-year run of the show. The Charwoman was a cleaning lady. She wore a dirty mop hat and a baggy outfit. She would push a mop across the stage at the end of episodes, often singing a wistful song called "I'm So Glad We Had This Time Together," which became the show's closing theme. The character was beloved. The original costume Burnett wore as the Charwoman is now in the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian. The Charwoman was not just a sketch character. She was, by the early 2000s, a piece of American television history. Burnett had something else that was tied tightly to her name. It was a small physical move, a gesture she did at the end of every episode. She would tug on her left earlobe. The earlobe tug was not part of any character. It was Burnett herself signing off. She had done it from the very first episode of her show in 1967. She did it as a private signal to her grandmother, who had raised her and who was watching at home. The earlobe tug was Carol Burnett saying goodnight to the woman who had brought her up. Audiences came to recognize it. It became one of the most personal, signature moves any television performer had ever developed. It was not a joke. It was not a bit. It was a private moment between a granddaughter and her grandmother that Burnett had decided to share with the country. In April of 2006, Family Guy aired an episode called Peterotica. The episode was about Peter writing audiobooks that turned out to be a major problem for Carter, his father-in-law. There is a scene early in the episode where Peter and his friends visit a pornography store called Pornoslavia. Peter is worried that the store will be dirty. Quagmire, one of his friends, tells him not to worry about it. Quagmire says that the store is pretty clean because Carol Burnett works part-time as a janitor. The scene then cuts away to a cartoon version of the Charwoman, in her famous outfit, mopping the floor of the porn shop. An altered version of the Charwoman's signature theme music plays underneath the scene. As the Charwoman mops, one of the characters comments on the earlobe tug. The line is crude. It suggests that Burnett used the earlobe tug not as a goodnight signal to her grandmother, but as a signal for something deeply inappropriate involving her father. The whole sequence lasted about 18 seconds. Burnett's reaction was not to ignore it. Her reaction was to file a federal lawsuit. On March 15th, 2007, she sued 20th Century Fox in the United States District Court in California for $2 million in damages. The lawsuit listed several different charges. It claimed copyright infringement because Family Guy had copied the Charwoman character without permission. It claimed trademark violation because the show had used Burnett's signature musical theme without permission. It claimed violation of her right of publicity, which is the legal right a famous person has to control the use of their own name and image. The complaint Burnett filed described in detail what had been taken. The Charwoman costume was reproduced almost exactly. The blue bonnet the cartoon character wore was a near copy of the original. The musical theme used in the cutaway was a clear alteration of Burnett's actual theme. The earlobe tug, a gesture that had been a private family signal in the original show, had been turned into a sex joke. The complaint argued that the show had taken something Burnett had built carefully over a 40-year career and dropped it into a porn shop for a laugh that lasted less than half a minute. There was a backstory to the lawsuit that did not appear on the surface. According to legal commentary published after the suit was filed, the parody may have been motivated by something that had happened earlier between Burnett and the Family Guy team. Family Guy had reportedly asked for permission to use Burnett's theme song in some other context. Burnett had said no. She had not refused out of spite. She reserved the song for her own personal appearances and special events. It was something she kept for herself. The Family Guy writers, denied the song they wanted, allegedly went ahead and made a cartoon that demeaned the character whose song they had been refused. The lawsuit was a response not just to a single 18-second cutaway, but to what Burnett saw as a kind of revenge for the no she had given them. 20th Century Fox responded to the lawsuit with a written statement that was almost mocking in its tone. The Fox statement said that Family Guy, just like the Carol Burnett Show, was famous for its pop culture parodies and satirical jabs at celebrities. The statement said the studio was surprised that Burnett, who had made a career out of spoofing others on television, would go so far as to sue Family Guy for a simple bit of comedy. The argument was that Burnett had spent her life being the parody maker, and now she was upset to find herself being parodied. The implication was that she would दुनिया चांदनी तेरे भाई खत्म करेंगे तेरे हार करेंगे तेरे हार पार करेंगे दुनिया तुझे आते नहीं क्या करें अब बुधवार यार में तो फिर क्या होता है गाड़ी गोल्फ की गोल्फ हॉकी से जो खेले हैं हॉकी गेम अच्छा है ये भी हाँ पैसे वाले खेले बहुत सबसे ज़्यादा ये अमीरों का खेल गोल्फ भी है सबसे महंगा खेल है
अपने साथ लगाते जाती करोगे तुम वसीम फहीम टेलीफोन फिश भाई तेरे खातिर मर जाएंगे याद करवाएंगे कहने को भूत डरियो याद न करे न गाता तेरे हवा नहीं करे न हाल में धोखा तेरा